To be here, cybersecurity, the electrical grid, and actually all of our critical infrastructure is a major issue for this country. You can imagine being held at risk and how that will impact our whole society. If we look at the 17 sectors of the critical infrastructure, there's an interrelationship with the electrical power grid being very central and foremost across that. If you look across each of the sectors, the need and the use of electrical power is a very important aspect. If we look at the avalanching or cascading failures that can occur across the critical infrastructure, you start with the electrical grid and then you look at the vulnerable nodes and then you follow that across each of these 17 sectors, then that's a major issue for this nation. And I can tell you that absolutely that we are at risk. It's not a matter of if, it's when, how bad it is, and the question is, what is our continuity of operation? The key word that we have to remember in all of this is resiliency. How well does our society continue to operate when we're under attack? And if we're in a state of war, then those attacks can be even more disastrous and more frequent. So we have to plan now. The role of the National Guard in the cybersecurity is critical and across our infrastructure because they exist in each of our states. So this activity of dealing and working with the states, the utilities, the corporations, the public, how to respond in case of an emergency. If we look at if the critical infrastructure goes down, then there's an issue of what happens, how do you respond to that? And that's where the role of training, exercises, and the partnership, really it's a partnership between government, military, industry, the general public, and how to respond. So we all have to be prepared. So from this point on, it's only an issue of how well we ensure that we make our electrical grid, our critical infrastructures resilient. So that requires, a lot of skills. It requires operational, tactical skills. It has to have knowledge of the critical infrastructure, how it's designed. Having spent my early years ago in the energy industry, what did we do? We designed our power plants, our refineries, our petrochemical plants, our pipelines. We automated everything, right? We wanted to make it more efficient. Well, we didn't really think about backdoors. We didn't really think about cyber. We were just trying to make the systems operate better. But now we have these issues of vulnerabilities. And then, of course, we have how do you change it? Where do you start? So the idea I mentioned earlier, being able to model the critical infrastructure, model the electrical grid to see, how does it work? How is it resilient? It's a dynamic system. It's, of course, spatially distributed. And, of course, much of it is owned across many different organizations. If you look at the number of utilities, the small utilities, it's not just the large utilities. It's an issue for these small, very small systems. How do they all interplay? If we look at how an electrical grid responds to a transformer failure, well, all of a sudden you may have a dip in the power. Well, how does the power come back up? You need to be able to model that. So the idea of being able to do analytical studies, understanding the electrical grid is important. Because that's a starting point. Well, you start with that and then you say, now let's say if we have an issue with this one particular transmission line, this one substation, this one generating plant. Well then, how do you work this? But what happens if it's attacked, you have 2 or 3 attack surfaces all occurring at the same time? It gets a little more complicated. So being able to plan and execute, and again, the role of the National Guard, understanding and maintaining resiliency of the electrical grid and working as a partnership with the state's leadership, with the companies, it's a really important role. And of course, I have to put my University of Delaware hat on, or I could put my Department of Defense or my intelligence community hat on. I need a trained workforce. I need to be able to generate and develop this. So it's nice to see all these young people here because maybe they can be our superheroes in the future. So we want people trained in this area. And also I have to go back again to the education side in this in terms of the general workforce. The idea of cyber hygiene. So many issues occur, whether it's an electrical grid or I'm operating a plant or I'm just operating a network or I'm on a network. Then I do something stupid, I click on something, and all of a sudden I've got a problem. So you need to train the workforce. So this workforce, of course, is the general employee. I'm not talking IT specialists. They have to be trained. They have to understand what you have to do and how you operate. What are the threats? How are things changing? It's a changing world. Technology is advancing. The attack surface is advancing. Then we have the leadership, the C-suite of the companies, and you have boards of directors. They each have different understandings they need to have. So the idea of educating the population is an important role. And I think, again, it's a team sport. The idea of each of us in this room, our organizations, working with the National Guard, and then thinking about our nation's critical infrastructure. How do we harden it? How do we make it better? And that's really the role we are. And I have to say, again, the National Guard in each of our states and working with our utilities is an important starting point because, again, I look at the electrical grid as kind of a base plate. And all of a sudden now I look at how does that touch to my water? How does that touch in terms of transportation? How does it touch into my refining petrochemical operations? So if I have a major failure, then it's a rippling, and so then you have a major issue. I always tell people my kind of a nightmare scenario is you take a look at the Houston Ship Channel. We have 80% of our petrochemical production. What happens if electricity is shut down along that ship channel? You imagine stopping all petrochemical feedstocks across the entire nation? Not just fuels, but medicines, pharmaceuticals, plastics. It all goes down. So these are the issues we have to look at, and again, the electrical grid is a good starting point. With that said, I'm going to try to keep us on time, and we'll let my next speaker come up.